Kia ora koutou katoa. So on behalf of the Board of Infrastructure New Zealand, I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's much-awaited political panel. Panel discussion will be facilitated by Fran O'Sullivan, who needs no introduction really. Fran is the Editorial Director Business at NZME. Fran is a leading business commentator who writes a regular column in the New Zealand Herald and appears frequently on television and current affairs shows. As Executive Editor of the Herald's Business Reports, Fran launched an annual infrastructure report in the Herald more than a decade ago. This report is published annually to coincide with Infrastructure New Zealand's Building Nations Summit. Fran was made an Officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit in the 2019 New Year's Honours for services to journalism and to business. Before I hand over to Fran to take it away with the panel, just a reminder to use the live Q&A function on your screen to post your questions during the session or to post any comments in the discussion forum. So I'll hand over to you, Fran.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Oh, great. Look, welcome to this panel. It's a pretty exciting time to be discussing transport infrastructure in New Zealand. And as Michael Wood, the Transport Minister, said earlier today, this is a major issue because transport emissions make up roughly half of our overall carbon emissions in New Zealand. So, you know, to get with the program, we actually have to tackle these issues. But it's not the only issue we have ahead of us. We have the problems COVID have introduced, particularly from the point of view of not being able to get supply chain management on time and to get the people to move on projects. So there's a bit of backed up work to do, a bit of backsliding also on budgets, which seem to have become much more aggressive as the COVID has worn on. But I look forward really to introducing the panel first and then actually having a discussion about some of these issues, and particularly also to you, the audience, getting engaged. This is your opportunity to put some very incisive questions to people who will be making the decisions in this very important area for New Zealand. Firstly, Michael Wood. Michael is the Transport Minister. He's had quite a big road to hoe. He's come in at a time when the transport upgrade program had to be reassessed. There's been issues around supply chains and some very big thorny decisions that he has had to grapple with, and particularly the one which comes up all the time at the moment, and he highlighted in his own speech about light rail. And this is something that the whole industry was looking forward to getting some clarity on as time goes by. Julianne Genter, also a former minister, big track record in the green sector and particularly relating to transport, passionate about it, a practitioner herself, is a former transport planner, and has been quite pivotal, particularly in the prior government, in influencing a range of decisions, and continues to use her position within politics to do that. David Bennett, National MP, more recently in the transport shadow portfolio. Again, big track record, been a parliamentarian for quite some time, concerned also about, yes, the major issues, but also what's happening, for instance, in the Waikato, which is part of that golden triangle for transport in New Zealand. And lastly, but by no means least, Simon Acort. Welcome, Simon, a recent ACT MP, again, somebody who is a practitioner, an engineer by training, who's had vast experience across a range of disciplines within infrastructure, and thus comes to it with a point of view which is probably a bit different to many of the other people who have been in Parliament recently. But what I wanted to do is just start on that challenge around what do we do about decarbonising the sector and the priorities that each of you see, and, you know, an opportunity to tell us how you see it, and perhaps also the role for the private sector in this space. Don't go too far in this part because we will actually take the conversation forward. But just to recap, Michael, if you could just give us a bit of an indication of how you see that fundamental challenge about decarbonising transport.
Thank you, Fran, and good afternoon, everyone. Look, this is one of the central challenges that we face across the transport sector. As you identified, Fran, transport's around about 47% of our CO2 emissions. So long story short, we don't get to net zero in 2050 if we don't decarbonise transport. That is going to take all of us working together, public sector, private sector, community, iwi, pulling our weight. And it's also going to mean that we'll need to employ a range of strategies and look at every part of the sector. Briefly, what I explained before is that we have 3 core strands to our strategy. The avoidance of emissions through better urban design so that people don't need to emit carbon as they go about their daily lives and go to work and this kind of thing. How we achieve mode shift, that is giving people better transport choices. We're currently one of the most car-dependent countries in the world because of the way we've built our transport system over 50 or 60 years. If we give people better choices, then we can have a lower carbon transport system. And finally, improving our existing car fleet. We have a very dirty fleet in New Zealand because of a lack of standards compared to other countries, and we're moving aggressively in that direction to clean up our fleet. It's bringing all of those things together and looking at a range of innovative ideas on the table that will help us to decarbonise our transport system.
Julianne?
I agree largely with what Michael has said, the Minister. I just really want to emphasize that climate change is a serious crisis, and the costs of unmitigated escalation of carbon emissions are going to be enormous. So there's really no option to continue with the status quo. But the huge opportunity in transport is not just decarbonization, but that through better planning and different prioritization, we can actually get a transport system that's far more energy efficient, that uses less land, which means it frees up valuable land in our cities for the things that people want to do in cities, like have homes and schools and parks and businesses. And it's an opportunity for cleaner air, quieter streets. Pretty much across the board, a different approach to transport is win-win. And I think the big challenge in achieving this is just that since about the 1950s, we've had a civil engineering-led approach that focused just on catering for growth in private vehicles, and that unintentionally used up tons of land in our cities, made it pretty near impossible to get around without a car, and that's been conflated as cars provide choice, but in truth, we haven't given people choice, and that's exactly what the Minister was referring to. So from here on out, we can prioritize different investments that not only benefit people who will then be able to use frequent all-day public transport or safe walking and cycling infrastructure. That means you can use not just bikes, but e-cargo bikes, which can make many more deliveries in a given amount of time, potentially for small items than a large courier truck could. And we have the opportunity to move people and goods in just a far more energy efficient way, as well as decarbonizing. And I think the risk is if we keep doing what we've always done, we can end up with electric vehicles, but still a lot of congestion, incredibly high costs, and not very productive transportation system. And in order to make those changes in prioritization, it does mean that we have to do things differently. And I guess we need to be able to tell that story, to work with the private sector, to work with engineers and planners to make sure that they actually are embracing a change in professional practice that is going to give people and businesses far better transport choices and far better housing options.
David?
Thank you very much, Fran, and thank you for the invitation to be on this panel today. And I just want to acknowledge all those people that are watching and have been such good supporters of the New Zealand infrastructure story over the time. So thank you for your good work in the sector. I agree with the previous speakers that we all see climate change as a huge issue going forward, and there's no doubt that we have to change to meet that need in the future. There's no doubt about that. However, we need to be pragmatic about that, and we need to look at technology and what the available solutions are. And what we see in the case at the moment is a real bias against roads. It's seen as the evil going forward when effectively they're going to be on electric vehicles on those roads anyway. So it doesn't stack up the government's animosity against roads. Secondly, when we do look at that change that we're seeing around the fleet, the rules don't stack up there either. We've got the Clean Vehicles Bill, or the UTEX, that's going through Parliament at the moment, and that bill tries to put New Zealand ahead of the European standards, even though we're a market that gets our vehicles from the Australian type specifications, and it doesn't take into account that we could be pragmatic and try and renew our fleet through hybrid vehicles in the meantime until we get to that stage where there are electric vehicles available. There are no electric utes that are going to be available in the next couple of years, and contrary to the government's point of view, it will become a tax on many of our new vehicles that come into the fleet. So we yes, all see the same goals that we need to achieve, but we would be sensible in how we would achieve that and take into account the technology that's out there and look at the opportunities we've got around using future fuels, making sure we've got that renewable source of energy. It's no point having cars that are electric if they're running off a coal-powered power station. You know, we need to make sure we invest in the whole infrastructure of New Zealand to achieve that, and we don't see that plan from the government. What we see are just a very iconic issues that they try and push forward and say that they're in the interests of climate change. And a great example in my region, the Waikato, for example, is a train that they created from Hamilton to Auckland that runs on diesel, you know, and, you know, everybody supports public transport and the need for that. But we've got to be practical around it, and there are better ways of doing it than what this government is at the moment.
Yeah, okay. So might come back to some of these issues. Simon.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to Infrastructure New Zealand for hosting this event. I'm sorry we can't do it in person, but I do look forward to meeting the stakeholders at this event next year or sooner if possible. ACT actually believes that transport policy should focus on good governance, good management, financing and procurement. We don't believe that politicians are picking projects or picking technical solutions is the way to go. That usually fails to solve the problem that we might all agree on. When it comes to decarbonisation, that's a great goal for the New Zealand economy. There's lots of cool technology that's being rolled out, if not in New Zealand, that's just over the horizon, like hydrogen heavy trucks, and of course electric vehicles are a part of that solution. And New Zealand's actually pretty cutting edge and already dealing with our climate emissions. We've got an emissions trading scheme which puts a hard cap on emissions and a price on emissions which is amongst the highest in the world. It also includes the transport sector, unlike Europe, which is still arguing about whether hedges on farms should be included in carbon capture. I actually think that the emissions trading scheme is the most predictable mechanism to decarbonise the economy. Now, when it comes to the so-called clean cars, the ute tax, fee baits and so on, look, consumers know that electric vehicles of some kind are the future, but cannot support a clean car tax. Handing relatively wealthy people huge wads of cash to buy a Tesla Model 3 doesn't seem like good use of public money at this time when we have projects, infrastructure projects like the New Zealand upgrade projects slashed from 13 billion to 6 billion. We've got healthcare, hospitals that need repairs urgently and to ramp up their services for a pandemic, and households are facing rising costs. All of the emissions are already captured within the emissions trading scheme. The price is around $65 a tonne of carbon emitted right now. The ACT Party believes that all of those price signals are sufficient to get businesses and households to change behaviour, and that's what they're doing, Fran.
Okay, look, just before we move on from this topic, is there a point each of you who are opposition politicians or are not in government but a supportive partner can see a big plus in the government's policy anywhere there? Because one of the important issues which confronts the infrastructure sector is this chopping and changing in between governments. People want to know, and we've heard some of that at this conference and also at previous Building Nations, that this is one of the big areas which the sector grapples with. These are big projects, time-consuming, money-consuming. I would just like you each just to nominate one area where you think the government's getting it right in decarbonisation.
Right. If we go back to your original question, is can you see any areas where we would agree? And like public transport, certainly in our big cities, is something we need to invest in, and we wouldn't disagree with that at all. And the priorities that the Labor government are looking at are different from what we probably would look at. But certainly investing in the network is essential in Auckland. As the previous national government invested in the CRL, the next stage of that is vital for Auckland. And we need to give our contractors certainty that that will happen, and that they have a lead in time where they can see what the next project after that may be as well. And that will take a good evaluation process. So there are some fundamental things like that that we don't disagree about. It's the projects, probably the politicisation that we're seeing in the projects that we would disagree with. But if you look at for electric vehicles, for example, we don't disagree with the movement to that, or hydrogen trucks or whatever. It's the timing and the planning that's gone into it, because, for example, that legislation, it's not practical. You could actually achieve a lot more if you used hybrid and other alternatives in the near future and the medium term.
Sorry, does David understand?
I'll nearly finish, Julianne.
Vehicles are also receiving discounts under the clean car discount.
No, after a few years, they actually will be paying as well. It's only EVs and plug-in electrics that.
But they are
initially.
Discount. It's
only for 2 years. 2 years.
Emissions per kilometer driven. So it's entirely technology neutral, and it incentivizes lower emissions vehicles from the beginning, and it's incredibly practical. In fact, all the evidence around the world and every country that has reduced emissions in their light fleet is that these two types of policies, fuel economy standards and price incentives at the point of purchase, are the only effective way to do that. France has been doing it for 20 years. Their highest fee on polluting vehicles is the equivalent of 60,000 New Zealand dollars.
Yeah, but when they do that, they look at what the market is, and we derive our vehicles from the Australian specifications, which generally come from the Japanese market. They do not.
So I've heard the
electric vehicles that are required.
That's
the whole point.
Policies are helping them prioritize. Their parent companies are prioritizing more low emissions vehicles for our market only as a result of these policies. The head of Nissan in Australia said it's embarrassing that Australia doesn't have similar policies.
We're 0.2% of the market, Julianne. We're not going to force that to happen, are we?
Okay, I'm just going to let Julianne finish, and then I'm going to come to Simon and Michael on this question.
Well, I just want to know if David Bennett thinks that the head of Toyota New Zealand and the head of all these car companies in Australia and New Zealand saying they want these policies because it helps them get more low emissions cars into New Zealand to be able to sell to business and households, if they think those businesses are wrong.
Well, none of those big car companies have said that they agree with this legislation. They understand it, but they haven't agreed with it. In fact, today we had comments from car companies that were very much against it. So the concept is there, it's the timing.
Your turn, Simon. Yeah.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Julianne. Look, the ACT Party is broadly supportive of a move to decarbonise transport. I think this discussion is evidence of the problem, though, which is the actual way that it's delivered is politicised, but it doesn't need to be. What we do need to do is actually have a solid pipeline of infrastructure projects that aren't based on which political party comes into office and picks and chooses a road or a railway. And so the industry can gear up to deliver major projects, train people, and develop the expertise that we need here in New Zealand. What ACT is really concerned about is that some of these projects, like Auckland Light Rail, for example, and the network that represents also to the north and the northwest of Auckland, and Let's Get Wellington Moving. These are projects that have been announced multiple times. They have very large budgets associated with them, and it appears that no work has been undertaken to protect the routes, to designate the land, and to acquire any more than a few scraps of land for these major projects. And of course, what we do know is that one thing is certain, the price of land goes up, the price of housing goes up year on year, and these projects will just become more and more expensive, which will reduce the overall benefits over time. So look, the ACT Party would encourage the government to actually work much faster and much harder on designating the land, doing the planning, and potentially designing elements of it at the same time, so they can actually get Wellington moving, whether it's on a bus or a train or through a tunnel, and Auckland, for goodness sakes, just get on with building something. I mean, I was working as an engineer for a contractor when the Dominion Road Express busway was announced and tendered, and I think they might have even awarded it to a contractor at procurement. And again, a change of regimes, a change of political administration put that project on ice and then killed it. Well, we could have built something by now, even if it's not perfect. The ACT Party believes that perfect is the enemy of good. We think the government should just get on with it.
Yeah, you're nodding away there, Michael Wood. I mean, how hard is it to actually get a purchase on this problem?
Yeah, well, Fran, look, to some degree, I agree with Simon Court's comments, and it's not a bad position for us that the biggest critique we've faced around a couple of these big projects like Auckland Light Rail and Let's Get Wellington Moving is we've been talking about this for a long time. Please get on and deliver. And that's very much what we're focused on now. We've had to reset both projects. They have had challenging periods, but actually there's been a lot of hard work this year amongst officials, amongst the sector, in terms of engaging with the community. And we're now at the point where clear decisions are being made by the funders to move them forward. And in the case of both of them, we're likely next year to move into quite a detailed phase where we can start to do some of the work that Simon's identifying around route protection and initial designations. Just a couple of other quick comments there. Yeah, on the clean car issue, I just say we don't need to be theoretical about this. The proof point is that we introduced the clean car discount in July of this year. And in its first 3 months of operation, we reduced the average emissions of vehicles coming into New Zealand's fleet by more than the reduction that was achieved over the prior 8 years. So we know that these policies work, and they've worked everywhere they're implemented around the world. You asked the question of the others at the beginning, what's a nice thing you can say about the government's program? Well, let me return that in one way. One thing I did agree with that the previous government set in place under Simon Bridges was the Auckland Transport Alignment Plan, which brought together central government and local governments' 10-year horizon for transport investment in Auckland. That's been an essential platform for us to develop that program and give certainty to the industry. When we came in, it wasn't fully funded and we dealt with that, but the concept fundamentally was solid and is the basis for a lot of progress that we're making in Auckland now.
Yeah, and this is one of the elements that's come up in the questions, and I'll just take one question here and while we're on this vein. And it basically says the opening debate shows there's agreement to where we all need to be, just each party differs and how to get there. Problem is no one gets anywhere without taking that first mile or step. As the delivery mechanism for all your policies, our ability to achieve on your behalf relies on being able to invest, train and resource, and the flip-flopping of policy over the last 10 years is impeding progress. How can you use cross-party collaboration more effectively going forward in the way the infrastructure industry is collaborating to deliver on the largest, most impactful projects? So that's a challenge to you all. How can you, is this a mechanism, through the Infrastructure Commission, through select committees, or how? Where's this commonality so we can get moving faster? Who'd like to kick that off?
I'd be happy to kick that off.
Yeah.
First, Fran. Sorry, David. Sorry, Julianne. I know you have a valuable contribution to make as well. Look, the ACT Party believes actually that central government and local government should be in a partnership to identify the transportation projects that are highest priority in each region, that the Infrastructure Commission has a role to play in identifying through its program management the pipeline of work that contractors should be preparing to undertake, but that also that if you were to bring the program management and those competencies of the Infrastructure Commission together with the funding knowledge from Crown infrastructure partners, for example, who funded the UFB, the ultra-fast broadband rollout, that actually might be a way to advance not just the program, but bring in the funding from the private sector, from Super Fund, from ACC, even if it's the Canadian Pension Teachers Fund, if they want to invest in our light rail, good on them. Actually, we think that if we take those decisions about program and funding out of the hands of politicians, but obviously elected politicians do have a role, and that is in identifying long-term objectives. The ACT Party would be supportive of an approach like that.
Now, those of you who have been ministers, does this appeal, losing your ability to, control the play?
Well, I would say that I mostly agree with what Simon has said. The one big difference, I think, is the idea that you can just give it to technical experts and that they will then deliver what the community is saying they want, because that hasn't happened for 70 years now. And so it's really important that we are clear about what the KPIs are, and we do have to have a shift. So when we talk about flip-flopping in the last 10 years, the reality is the National Party chose 7 politically motivated projects, the roads of national significance. There's no objective measure by which those projects were the best projects to improve mobility of goods and services around New Zealand, and they certainly weren't the best way to spend money to enable people and goods to move in a lower carbon way. So we had to change direction, and we really need the industry to help us, not justify the big projects that they think they've made investments in kit that's going to be useful for this, or landowners have made plans about building housing way out on the fringe that needs this motorway to service it. We need to now kind of really organize around what objectively, with our carbon budget and our transport budget, every dollar needs to be used in the most effective way to future-proof the ability of people and goods to move around with low carbon emissions. And that means in an energy efficient way. And so I think the big challenge here is this disconnect about how we did transport planning for 50 years or now 70 years, and how we need to do it in the future. And I do think that the community has to be involved. So the way I see this infrastructure commission really useful, I actually think NZTA has become overly centralized, and we probably need to resource local and regional government in a better way. It needs to be a little bit more, we need to make sure it's democratic and representative. We need to make sure they're properly funded, and there probably should be priorities pushed forward more from a local and regional point of view, as long as they're meeting that goal of reducing emissions and achieving mode shift to the more energy efficient modes.
Yeah,
thank you, Fran. Oh, right. Go ahead, David.
Do you want me to get? Yeah. Well, Julianne's just completely incorrect, saying there was no objective test for the roads national significance. They were completely the priorities of each region, and that was what Simon talked about as well, having those regional priorities that were worked together, and that came through into the transport funding network. We've lost that under this government. You've got multiple funding sources that they're using, and you've lost the integrity of our system through having those politicised funding sources and the way that they allocate projects. And we wouldn't be of the view of the ACT Party that anything is good. The best thing we need to do something for Auckland once in the next few years to keep the CRL momentum going. But the Auckland rail link doesn't stack up. It's only 10% of Auckland's potential growth there. The minister will say it's 20%, but those are figures that are using a very optimistic scenario. On the reality of the growth that you're seeing in Auckland, it is not the best bang for buck. If you're going to spend 10 years of Auckland's capital expenditure, you want to make sure you're going into the right areas and where the growth is. And so there are opportunities to the west and to the north and the south, which stack up a lot more. So what you do need is a strong infrastructure plan, and the infrastructure strategy that has been talked about is a great starting point in that. And that needs to look at freight and at commuters. And then you need an evaluation criteria, which actually gives some substance to it. But you don't want to be political and say any road is bad, like the Green Party would say, and you don't want to be like the Labour Party where you pick your favourite things.
Hey, enough politics. I'm just going to come now to Michael Wood, because there was an element there about the Infrastructure Commission, and obviously it's been producing a range of plans, and I just want to get a sense of what is your judgment on the work they've done to date, and are you prepared to look at those priorities and actually reach agreement with them, so that we actually have what the Infrastructure Commission was set up to do, is, as I understood it, create this external independent lens outside of politics, looks at everything rationally. And are you prepared to go with what they recommend in terms of sequencing and priorities?
Well, thanks, Fran. If I can address that and your original question, I do think that there is value in, as much as we can, seeking collaboration and consensus in this policy area as well as others. So the example of the Infrastructure Commission, which we have established, is about that. It's about trying to move New Zealand past the short-termism, which has sometimes guided our investment decisions and has led to degraded assets across a range of asset classes, to giving us that 30-year plus window and planning horizon, both in terms of creating new assets, but actually just as critically in terms of the maintenance and care and stewardship of our existing assets, which we see in water having been let go over so many decades. So we've set up the Infrastructure Commission with serious intent that we do take on board its work and its analysis. And I think it does give us a basis for trying to develop consensus across political boundaries and across the broader community. We're also doing other things to try and achieve that. So, for example, on the significant question of congestion charging, early this year, I wrote to the Parliamentary Select Committee to ask them to undertake an inquiry. And I'm really delighted that we had cross-party consensus coming through, every single party at the table, making a recommendation back to the government to move forward there, which we intend to take seriously and are consulting on in the ERP. I've even invited David in tomorrow for a cup of tea to talk about Auckland Light Rail, so that we can actually have a fact-based discussion about the benefits that it can deliver. But I would add one thing onto the end, Fran, which is important in these conversations. Having said all of that, and understanding the need for us to have as much certainty and understanding that's desirable for the sector, you cannot uniquely sort of cordon off transport and say that it is free of political debate and decision making. Okay, different parties will have different ideas in this area, and it is appropriate in a democracy that there is a that mandates a sort, and that governments can move forward with clear policies. There are areas we can try and find agreement, and I think where we can, we should. But actually, where there are clear democratic differences, that's appropriate as well. So we've talked about climate change. David says that he wants to lean mainly on the ETS. That's their approach. We actually think
that was the
strategic approach to leading the investments.
Okay, just a comment here, not a question, from someone on the line. It just says basically this approach is exactly why central government should stay away from delivering infrastructure. They should fund it, monitor it, the delivery, and let local government and corporate organisations deliver stuff, which takes us to the point, what is the role for the private sector in delivering infrastructure? Just a very quick one, because we do have to get on to light rail.
Well, all of our infrastructure is delivered by the private sector through a competitive tender process. We don't have a Ministry of Works, but I think there is some difficulty, I think, and I don't know if this is really emphasized enough, in trying to get private finance involved. And that is because it is extremely difficult to get a commercial return from one piece of infrastructure on its own, it's just that the benefits are quite widespread. And so it's very difficult to get like that commercial return where there are, positive public economic benefits from investing in infrastructure. And so I think that we will always find it difficult to have PPPs for finance work out in the public's favor. They always end up being a little bit more expensive.
Yeah, I think history would show that by and large, the Crown's done quite well out of PPPs to the detriment of the other side from time to time in recent years. Anyway, I'm going to pass.
The financiers have done very well out of transmission valley. It's the contractors who didn't.
Yeah, they have.
The public didn't.
No, I agree with that. Look, just coming to light rail, because it is the subject of your conversation and cup of tea tomorrow. Where do you sit on it, David?
Well, it depends what kind of biscuits he's going to deliver. But the reality is that we see real issues in the quantum of cost, and it was a political promise made, and the minister even has confirmed that in his speech today and last night in the House, saying this is a manifesto commitment. And when we're dealing with billions of dollars of public money, it's going to be the biggest spend we've seen. Surely that should be in what is in the best interest of Aucklanders and the best interest of Transport Solutions, and not a political manifesto promise. And I know what it, you know, and as he said before, there is always an element of politics, and there are two political parties and that have different views, or the whole spectrum of political parties have different views on certain issues. But fundamentally, if you believe in public transport as the answer, which he's saying, and we believe in public transport for Auckland as well, do the right best project for Auckland, and not the political one that you promised 4 years ago, couldn't get off the ground, have done continuous business cases and found it didn't work. Now, we saw that with the walking and cycling bridge across the harbour. Good credit to the Labour government, they actually fell on their sword on that one. This one, they can do the same. There are other priorities. There are bigger growth zones in Auckland. You've got the north, you've got the west, and the south that are growing at a much higher proportion than that area. The numbers don't stack up for growth in that area. It is a purely political project. It skews our transport planning, and we would back a good solid project in Auckland that makes commercial sense, and this one doesn't.
Okay, quick defence, Michael, because I'm aware you did talk to the conference about it earlier today.
Yes, thank you, Fran. A couple of key points. The first is that light rail is a project that's actually been talked about and analysed and planned for in Auckland for over 10 years. It's been subject to multiple business cases, including the indicative business case that the establishment unit has just produced, which says that this is a necessary investment for Auckland and that its business case stacks up. It has a positive BCR and a positive economic and strategic case sitting in behind it. Fundamentally, what it's about is not sometimes, as it's been talked about, a point-to-point journey between the central city and the airport. It's about the first stage of building up a linked-up mass rapid transit network for Auckland. We're going to be a city of 2 million people before long, and we lack the core mass rapid transit system that is necessary to stop us choking on congestion, to stop us emitting hugely, and it unlocks the capacity for significant additional housing. So imagine a full rapid transit network that includes a city centre to Mangere line, major centres of employment, huge areas of housing growth, but then also additional lines in terms of the alternative Waitemata Harbour crossing heading to the north and getting high quality mass rapid transit to the northwest, linked into the existing heavy rail system and the busway system. You then start to have the real bones of a rapid transit system that can unlock urban growth and make our city a more pleasant place to get around and support significant additional housing that we don't need to build through urban sprawl. Do remember this, if we don't make these investments to support housing within our existing urban form, we'll have to make the infrastructure investments on the fringes of the city where it will be more expensive and contribute to worse outcomes for residents.
And I'm not sure Mr. Bennett's aware that the City Centre Future Access Study, which first concluded that light rail was necessary on this particular corridor and alignment, was funded under Jerry Brownlee being Minister of Transport. A lot of the original business case work that concluded that light rail was the right solution for Dominion Road through Mangere to the airport happened while National was in government. And that is why we ended up adopting it on the basis of that, you know, as a policy, was because all this work had been done on it. So, I mean, I just don't think Mr. Bennett knows what he's talking about.
No, well, that's not true, Julianne, because the thing is that the fact is that if you're looking at light rail, the issue is that the next best thing for Auckland, and it doesn't stack up economically. We can find a positive business case for nearly anything we want to do, and the minister says that, but he doesn't qualify it with ranking it with other projects that would be needed. And if you're looking at the extension of the Auckland rail network to the North Shore, for example, and public transport is that part of that second crossing, we fully endorse having public transport as a big part of that. But the Auckland rail project is not the impetus or the catalyst to make that happen. And actually, if you carry on the CRL through to the North Shore, is actually the next step to make that happen. And so it's a matter of prioritising it to be in the best interest of Aucklanders, looking at where their growth and their economic potential is. And this project is purely political.
Well, Mr. Bennett, it is possible to do more than one thing at any one time, and that's why at the same time as we're moving forward with Auckland Light Rail, we have $60 million in ATAP to start the business case work for the additional Waitemata Harbour crossing. And I will have to say it's news that the National Party supports a heavy rail crossing to the North Shore. Might have value, but will come at significantly higher cost than a light rail connection.
But the 60 million is a very small fraction of money, and dealing with a case that is in the billions of dollars. And your plans for the second harbour crossing are well into the future, like 2040 or 2030 now, maybe. So it is beyond the realm of reality to see that happening at the same time. We've got to make a choice.
The cost ratio for the vehicle crossing that the National Party said they support is under 0.2, so it's significantly less than 1. And that's, trust me, I'm sure the engineers in charge of that were trying to get the best possible BCR they could for that. So I just don't believe the National Party when they say that they want to prioritize the most cost-effective transport projects. And they seem to be the ones who are politically attacking light rail, despite the fact that the case for it was made while they were in government. Not that it was a political priority for them, but just that there's a physical constraint on the number of buses that can get into the city center, and Dominion Road carrying most of those buses. Of course, there's always been a plan to upgrade the busway to light rail, and I see a huge potential for a rapid transit connection from the north to the west. It's a shame that when State Highway 16 out west was upgraded, under national, there wasn't a separated busway put in. That really should have happened, and it should be a major priority now.
Yeah.
We're building it now.
Thank you, Fran. Look, I think the nature of the conversation we've just witnessed illustrates the point that the ACT Party would make, that politicians, while we might all have an opinion, are actually not the right people to be deciding on what mode, what project. That's why we would propose a nation-building agency combining the Infrastructure Commission with Crown infrastructure partners, bringing the brains and the money together, identifying what are the project priorities, and then delegating the delivery to the properly named New Zealand Transport Agency. Now, NZTA, despite the problems they've had on some projects, are actually the best organisation we've got right now to deliver major infrastructure projects. And they're already program managing and project managing rail projects on behalf of Kiwi Rail. They have some experience in this. I think what we saw under the previous Labour-led government and the way that they tried to procure the Auckland Light Rail project through unusual approaches, ignored the advice of NZTA, that shows you where we actually need to get back on track, get the politics and the politicians out of decision making, let them set the long-term goals, but actually let the engineers and the planners and the landscape architects and all of those people get together around the table and work out how to deliver the programs and the objectives that New Zealanders expect their politicians to be delivering for them.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's probably something that both yourself and Julianne, in your respective professional capacities prior to politics, might find quite an interesting challenge and position to be on. Look, just one of the questions before we do address the second crossing of the Waitemata is looking at intermodality and what do people feel about, for instance, moving from road to rail where possible, and other active transport options.
I can continue with that. I mean, the ACT Party is mode neutral. If the project stacks up, then that's fine. If it's going to shift people out of cars and reduce congestion, reducing congestion and letting freight and people get around the region faster, and we're talking about Auckland now, of course, but the same applies to Wellington, the same applies to Tauranga and to Waikato, and to Northland, of course, through a very, very narrow corridor, State Highway 1. Look, if the benefit cost ratio stacks up, there may well be a case for a second harbour crossing in the future. But I can promise you, if I'm a Minister of Transport and officials come to me and say, look, this crossing's got a benefit cost ratio of 0.3, I would expect the opposition at the time to be giving me an absolute grilling about it. These things have to stack up financially, because we're a small country with a very small wealth base, and we have a small GDP by comparison, low productivity. We can't afford to be gold plating everything. The ACT Party firmly believes that perfect is the enemy of good, that we should be getting on actually with relieving congestion, protecting corridors, and setting ourselves up for success.
Okay, we've been there before, but just talking about, making those modal shifts as well, utilising rail more. Clearly, we had the North Harbour port study last year, which has sort of been sitting there in abeyance, as I understand it. How important is it to actually explore the greater use of rail, and notwithstanding the comments earlier by David Bennett about the poor utilisation of Auckland to Hamilton rail link, but is there a case there for spurring that along faster?
I think we've got to be. Oh, Jeanette.
Oh, I was just going to say, I fully support passenger rail, rapid rail between Auckland, Hamilton, and Tauranga. And unfortunately, what has been rolled out as a pilot is not good enough. It's not going to, it's not at the standard, it's not fast enough, and it's not frequent enough to really be useful. So I think we do really need to put a lot into providing the alternatives. And, we have a road network. The best way to use that road network now is to shift more people and goods off of that road network onto alternatives. And if we're going to do congestion pricing, we are going to need a lot more alternatives than what we currently have. And that's why it's not that roads are evil. It's just that from now on, every dollar we put into new infrastructure is going to be more cost effective if we put it into things that optimize the use of our existing networks. And so that's just where we have to invest, because we haven't invested for the past few decades. And so that we really need to go very, very hard in that direction of providing the alternatives, and that will actually free up our existing road network. It's just maths. It's not values, it's just maths.
We're taking a very city-centric approach here too, we've got to look at the opportunities for New Zealand going forward. We're a primary producing country that relies heavily on the infrastructure in our regions. You've got basically the population of South Island now between Hamilton and Tauranga in the very near future, in that growth corridor there. Sometimes rail works, like it works really well from Tauranga Port to Hamilton to Auckland to Wellington, but it doesn't work so well in other areas. And so we need a multimodal solution, and this government has really ditched roads and said everything is the answer is in rail. And that's just not going to be
when the majority of what they're spending is on urban highways.
And that's not practical. And we need to invest in our state highway infrastructure, and we need to invest in our local roads, and we need to invest in public transport as well. And so saying that one is going to solve all issues just doesn't work that way.
Well, I mean, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that the majority of the CapEx that's being spent on new projects is currently being spent on urban motorways, including being proposed in Wellington, in Otaki to north of Levin, Penlink, the widening of the southern motorway in Auckland.
But they're projects that have been started before. If you look at the New Zealand Upgrade Program, for example, the Labor government promised took away the northern Tauranga part of that link.
On urban roads,
and that's crucial for that growth.
Okay, let's just let the minister say something here.
Yeah, thank you, Fran. Look, having an integrated multimodal transport system is absolutely essential for urban commuters and also for our freight system and regional communities. The thing is here is that we're the first government that's actually embedded that approach in the government policy statement in transport, and actually set up activity classes to invest across all of those modes. When we came into government, rail was in a state of managed decline and was absolutely on its knees. So we have rebalanced the levels of investment to make sure that we are investing across all of those modes. And we're beginning to see the fruits of it now. The Auckland Commuter rail network between the early 2000s, when Britomart opened and pre-COVID, the patronage increased by 500% because of basic service improvements. Our investments in the Napier to Wairua rail line have now resulted in trains on that line every single day taking logging trucks off the road and moving them in a way that causes less damage and fewer carbon emissions. And don't forget coastal shipping as well. For the first time since the previous Labor government, we now have an activity class for coastal shipping. And actually just to I've released a report that I commissioned through the Ministry of Transport to set the direction for Waka Kotahi in terms of how it makes those investments in the coastal shipping sector. What we need is to get all of these modes working together in concert to move people and goods efficiently around the country. And I'll just put in a plug here, Fran, for the work that we are doing to develop for the first time ever for New Zealand a national supply chain strategy. The Ministry of Transport now has that work underway. That'll help us to bring the modes together and also help us to answer key strategic questions, such as the one you referenced before about the future of the Auckland port.
Why is it taking so long to look at that question again?
Well, it's a pretty big issue.
It's still looking very much like those things that have end up being around for 10 years and no calls made.
Yeah, no, look, it's one of those issues where we do believe that a call does need to be made, and I would like our government to be in a position to do that. But it would be one of the biggest, most strategic infrastructure interventions made to make that decision. So we do need to work through it carefully. It is one of those projects where ideally we would want to develop broad consensus around where we go. The options have been narrowed down by the work that has been done in recent years. And I think we need to work around those. But I'll say this is the sequencing here is to get the national supply chain strategy in place. And we should base it off the work that we do, listening to people on the ground, to work out what the best solution to this particular issue is.
Okay, we're starting to run out of time, but I'm just quite keen to get a view from each of you, either on the Waitemata crossing or what you might like to see happening in another part of New Zealand. Take your pick, starting with you, Julianne.
I'd like to see a walking and cycling and mass transit bridge investigated for the next Waitemata crossing. I think they'll be faster to deliver and will carry more benefits. And option 4 for Let's Get Welly Moving, which is the most climate friendly and the most cost effective option. And again, something we could get on with more quickly.
And you, Simon?
Well, I think there are far higher priority programs and projects currently than a cycle bridge or a second harbour crossing. There are a number of projects that would have improved freight connections and improved safety around the country. That could have been a version of the East-West Link Road. It didn't have to be that design. There's much cheaper designs could have been delivered. There is the 4-laning from Whangarei to Port Marsden. That's a very dangerous piece of road. And while the minister has allocated funding for a rail spur, there's still a very clear justification for 4-laning that piece of the highway. And then, as David Bennett described, the projects around Tauranga and the Bay of Plenty, which will save lives and actually improve freight connections and connections between communities. And that's really why politicians need to be taken out of the decision-making loop and leave it up to agencies.
David, you'll go.
Well, I think that there is a need for a second crossing in Auckland, and we see the real advantage of having a strong public transport element to that as well. So we don't agree with the walking and cycling bridge that fell over because it was not planned and wasn't a great idea. And the other part of Auckland is probably going out west is the real deficiency there. There's a huge growth out that area. And there isn't great public transport options going to the west. So over time, that really needs to be invested in as well. There's other multiple projects around the country that you could pick in my region, the Waikato Bay of Plenty, certainly many options there. You've got around Hawke's Bay, you've got Christchurch, and all those places have their multiple projects. And so it's getting that balance right, and we haven't got a balanced system at the moment. We've got a skewed system to political priorities. We've got a skewed system to public transport, walking and cycling, and it doesn't take into account the geography of New Zealand. And so we need to move back to a system where it's not so politicised in the projects, that we actually have a strategy that is in the best interest of New Zealand. And so we would support that.
Running out of time. Just in brief, very quick reply from you, Michael Wood. What will you say? What will you say to Mr. Bennett tomorrow when you meet?
Well, firstly, Fran, it's got to be a mass rapid transit centred crossing across the Waitamatā, and the regional project that I pick is a really visionary 15-minute city that's been developed by the Hamilton City Council, which is focused around safe, accessible walking and cycling options for the people of that city to avoid terrible urban sprawl and increased congestion. Look, what I'll be saying to Mr. Bennett tomorrow is that I don't expect to change his mind overnight, but I want to establish a real dialogue around significant infrastructure issues like these. And I want us to be thinking about the urban growth challenges that we face in our major metropolitan centres, and the fact that we have to change tack from the failed policies of the last 70 years that have got us to this point, and start making the smart investments that move large numbers of people efficiently and support urban growth, which is what Auckland Light Rail does.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to close you all out now. Sounds like the beginning tomorrow of a very good conversation between the pair of you, and hopefully also Julianne and Simon will be invited also to start to build this consensus that seems to be much needed in New Zealand on our transport infrastructure and the challenges and solutions we face. It will be very interesting to check in another year or so just how far you all got on this great détente. So thank you once again. You've been generous in your responses. You've played nicely, and yeah, look forward to progress. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
Fran.
much.
Thank you.
Excellent sharing.
Thank you, Fran, and to all the speakers for such a lively and engaging discussion this afternoon. It was great. I'd just like to remind you all to attend the next session. Don't miss it. It's the inaugural Construction Sector Accord Beacon Awards. Thank you. Mate wai.